On December 5, 1994, three presidents gathered in Budapest. Bill Clinton, Boris Yeltsin, and Leonid Kuchma signed a document that would later be invoked as either a triumph of non-proliferation or its greatest tragedy, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. Ukraine possessed the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, 1,900 strategic warheads, 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and 44 strategic bombers. In exchange for surrendering this deterrent, Ukraine received not legally binding security guarantees, but what scholars carefully term security assurances, a critical distinction in international law. The Trilateral Statement of January 14, 1994, which preceded the memorandum, established the framework. Ukraine sought legally binding guarantees that the United States would intervene if its sovereignty were breached. Washington refused. The term guarantee implied a commitment to use military force, something the US government would not provide, and something the Senate would almost certainly not ratify. Instead, the memorandum committed signatories to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, to refrain from the threat or use of force, and to seek immediate UN Security Council assistance if Ukraine became a victim of aggression. It was a political commitment, not a treaty. It created moral obligations without legal mechanisms for enforcement. As the Lieber Institute at West Point later assessed, the document was carefully crafted with the intention not to reflect any legal obligations on the part of the United States or Russia. The myth that Ukraine could have maintained its arsenal persists in popular discourse, but the empirical reality was different. Soviet warheads had relatively short shelf lives, and the infrastructure to build and support them was located almost entirely in Russia. Ukrainian officials briefly considered retention and concluded they could not afford the necessary investment at a time when their economy was collapsing. Disarmament was not foolishness. It was rational calculation under constraints that appeared reasonable in 1994. What neither Ukrainian nor American officials foresaw was the precise nature of Russian violation. The memorandum's drafters did not imagine a world in which Russia would seize Crimea in 2014, instigate war in Donbass, and launch full-scale invasion in 2022. Had they foreseen it, Kyiv would have demanded more solid guarantees, which Washington and London were not prepared to give. Negotiations would have deadlocked. What would have happened then is one of history's great counterfactuals. The Ukraine war exposed the fundamental tension in extended deterrence. Promises are credible only when backed by willingness to sacrifice. And democracies rarely sacrifice for peripheral interests. When Russia invaded in February 2022, the United States provided weapons, intelligence, and economic sanctions. It did not provide the one thing the Budapest Memorandum implied, but never guaranteed: direct military defense of Ukrainian sovereignty. The assurance had been a managed ambiguity, and ambiguity collapsed under the weight of Russian tanks. This was not American betrayal in the technical sense. The memorandum never obligated military intervention, but it was perceived as betrayal in the political sense by Ukrainians, and, more importantly, by states considering whether to entrust their security to great power promises rather than independent capability. The academic literature on extended deterrence identifies the core problem. Credibility requires that a protecting state demonstrate willingness to risk its own cities for its allies' territory. The giving up Los Angeles for Seoul dilemma. As North Korea developed ICBMs capable of reaching the American mainland, this willingness became increasingly questionable. A 2023 poll showed that roughly half of South Koreans doubted the US would respond in kind if North Korea used nuclear weapons against the South. By 2024, only 39% of South Koreans believed the US would defend them with nuclear weapons. The Washington Declaration of April 2023 attempted to address this credibility gap. The Biden and Yoon governments established a nuclear consultative group, conducted tabletop exercises, and deployed the USS Kentucky, a nuclear missile submarine, to Busan. Yet these confidence-building measures had a paradoxical effect. A subsequent poll revealed that South Korean confidence in American extended deterrence actually dropped after the summit. The more Washington demonstrated commitment, the more Seoul questioned its sufficiency. This is the credibility trap. Extended deterrence works when the threat is abstract and the ally feels protected. When the threat becomes concrete, when North Korea possesses medium-range missiles, when Russia seizes territory, when Iran enriches to 60%, the ally begins calculating whether the protector's interests truly align with its own survival. The credibility vacuum produced predictable behavior. States with technical capability and security anxiety began moving towards self-help nuclearization. Saudi Arabia represents the most explicit case. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stated unequivocally, if Iran obtains a nuclear weapon, the kingdom will have to follow suit. This was not ambiguous deterrence rhetoric. It was a declared conditional proliferation commitment. The kingdom's nuclear infrastructure has expanded accordingly. Saudi authorities have worked with the IAEA to develop regulatory frameworks and solicited reactor bids from China National Nuclear Corporation, France's EDF, Korea's KEPCO, and Russia's Rosatom. More significantly, Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman announced in 2019 the intention to pursue the full cycle, from producing uranium to enriching the uranium to using the uranium. In January 2023, he reiterated that Saudi Arabia intended to use domestic uranium resources for producing low-enriched uranium fuel. Chinese cooperation has facilitated this ambition. A 2012 bilateral agreement between King Abdullah and Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao laid the groundwork. CNNC offered to construct reactors. Chinese geologists assisted in locating uranium deposits in the kingdom's northwest and the Neom region. By 2018, Saudi Arabia, in partnership with Chinese companies, had erected nuclear reactors for producing yellowcake uranium ore. The Saudi strategy is deliberately multi-aligned. Riyadh uses the possibility of choosing Chinese or Russian nuclear supply as leverage to extract more advantageous terms from Washington. As one analyst noted, their overtures towards China or other nations like Russia appear to be born out of the United States' reluctance to grant Saudi Arabia access to the entire nuclear fuel cycle. This is not alliance abandonment. It is optionality procurement, the same strategy Turkey has pursued. South Korea's case is more urgent and more revealing. In 2023, President Yoon Suk-yeol stated that given the rising North Korean nuclear threat, Seoul may need to introduce tactical nuclear weapons or build them on our own. Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun noted in 2024 that with respect to nuclear weapons, all options are open. The threat calculus is stark. North Korea has moved from a small primitive arsenal to a medium-sized force with growing capabilities. 50-100 weapons yields up to 200 kilotons, solid-fuel road-mobile ICBMs capable of reaching the US mainland, and tactical nuclear roles in military doctrine. The Hwasong-18, tested in 2023, provides a second strike capability that can be launched with little warning and few support vehicles. Japan's evolution has been incremental but directional. In 2015, the Abe administration reinterpreted the constitution to allow collective self-defense. In 2022, the Kishida government formally introduced counter-strike capabilities in revised security documents. More recently, under new leadership, Japan has accelerated restructuring of self-defense forces, deployment of long-range missiles, and debate over revisions to its 3 non-nuclear principles. The February 2026 lower house election secured a 2/3 majority for the ruling coalition, the threshold required to initiate constitutional amendments. Each case is distinct in motivation and mechanism, but the common thread is clear. Extended deterrence is being supplemented or supplanted by independent capability. The American security umbrella no longer provides sufficient assurance for states facing existential nuclear threats. The 2026 Iran war shattered what remained of the non-proliferation verification architecture. Between June 2025 strikes and April 2026 negotiations, the IAEA lost continuity of knowledge. The agency confirmed that Iran had accumulated 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a short technical step from weapons grade. In February 2026, the IAEA reported it had not had access to Iran's previously declared inventories of low-enriched uranium and high-enriched uranium for more than 8 months, making verification long overdue according to standard safeguards practice. The agency could not verify whether Iran had suspended enrichment, could not assess the size of uranium stockpiles at affected facilities, could not confirm centrifuge inventories, and could not determine whether undeclared material had been diverted. Director General Rafael Grossi warned that without inspectors, any agreement would be an illusion of an agreement. The institutional damage extended beyond Iran. The Spanish Institute for Strategic Studies assessed in 2025 that the non-proliferation regime faced concatenation of crises and collapse of the institutional architecture, potentially leading a significant number of states with the necessary technical capabilities to take the step of incorporating nuclear weapons into their security doctrines. A scenario of nuclear multipolarity within a context of international strategic tension would increase the risk of nuclear use to much higher levels than in the Cold War, where the duopoly in practice of the US and the Soviet Union allowed for strategic stability. This is the architecture of monopoly collapse. The NPT was built on a grand bargain. Non-nuclear states renounce weapons in exchange for disarmament, progress by nuclear states, and assistance with peaceful energy. The bargain has broken in both directions. Nuclear states have not disarmed. Non-nuclear states facing existential threats have observed that Ukraine's renunciation produced not security, but invasion. The post-Ukraine proliferation wave is not merely the result of Russian aggression. It is the culmination of a structural crisis in extended deterrence that has been building for decades. First, the distinction between assurances and guarantees proved fatal. The Budapest Memorandum created the impression of protection without the mechanism of enforcement. When protection failed to materialize, the perception was not that a non-binding political commitment had been ignored, but that the international community had betrayed a vulnerable state. This perception now shapes decisions in Seoul, Riyadh, and Tokyo. Second, the technical feasibility of independent nuclear programs has increased. Enrichment technology has diffused. Uranium deposits are mapped. Delivery systems are purchasable. The breakout time that obsesses non-proliferation analysts assumes a state is starting from zero. Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and Japan are not starting from zero. They are starting from advanced civilian infrastructure, established supply chains, and existing security relationships with nuclear technology holders. Third, the credibility of American extended deterrence has become audience-dependent. For NATO's eastern flank, threatened by Russia, the commitment appears robust because the US has demonstrated willingness to risk escalation. For East Asian allies facing North Korea and China, the commitment appears conditional because the adversary possesses capability to strike the American homeland. For Middle Eastern partners facing Iran, the commitment appears transactional because American policy shifts with electoral cycles. The non-proliferation monopoly depended on a simple proposition: it is safer to rely on great power protection than to pursue independent nuclear capability. Ukraine disproved that proposition. The question is no longer whether states will proliferate. The question is which states will proliferate next, and whether the international system can manage the transition from oligopoly to multipolar nuclear competition without the catastrophic use that the original non-proliferation architecture was designed to prevent. The architecture has not failed because states are irrational. It has failed because states are rational enough to observe that guarantees without enforcement are promises, and promises without sacrifice are just words.